Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another edition of Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here. Today, August 16th, continues to be one of the darkest days in the history of democratic South Africa. It was the day that many mine workers who had landed or had gone onto the copy of Marikana for one thing, better working rights, for the ability to provide more for their families, to see the community of Marikana being uplifted. It was to and from with unions and, of course, the directors and shareholders of Lonmin Mine, now, of course, Sibanye Stillwater. It unfortunately ended in bloodshed. 34 mine workers lost their lives, 78 were seriously injured. It's a day that still, as we stand, 11 years later, we are yet to get the answers that the mine workers' families deserve, and of course, the public of South Africa deserve. So today we're going to be, again, reflecting on it. Last year, in one of the very first episodes of Talking Point, we had spoken about Marikana. A year later, there's still no real closure as to what had happened. So let me introduce my guest to you. I have Thato Masingoako. She is a researcher at SERI. And joining us on Zoom, I'd like to welcome Mr. Andries Nkome. He is a Marikana defense attorney, and he represents 279 mine workers who were arrested during that day at Marikana. So let me welcome my guest here. Thato, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here at Talking Point.
Thank you for having me, and good afternoon to your viewers.
And I'd like to welcome Mr. Nkome. Mr. Nkome, thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point.
Good afternoon, sir, and thanks for having me. Good afternoon to your viewers too.
It's an absolute pleasure to have both of you. Mr. Nkome, I'm going to start off with you. Let's talk about those legal proceedings because obviously a year on, many of the families are still processing what had happened. You are one of those very first within the legal fraternity to take this case head on. Talk to us about the beginnings, the roots of these legal proceedings.
When we arrived at Marikana, it was on the 18th of August in 2012. It was on a Saturday. And when we got there, simply because of the confusion that was reigning, we took instructions from everybody. That is the families of the deceased mine workers, the arrested, as well as the injured. Everybody else came through to us to seek assistance. And the first thing that we had to do was work around questions about bail, simply because 279 people at that time had been arrested and many others had not been known. They had not been known where they were, in the sense that they were injured, taken to various different hospitals. Now, it was over time that we got to be surprised that government was charging the clients that we represent, those that had been arrested, with the murders of the brothers or the colleagues that they had gone on strike with. That was obviously to this day, it's still an absurdity. So we started there. We went through to the Farm Commission of Inquiry set up by the then President Jacob Zuma, and he had excluded, in the terms of reference, the inclusion of the survivors of the massacre, which we found very odd. But either way, we decided that we were going to go through and make sure that we put the survivors' case onto the record. So between then and now, we have gone through to courts to seek parity of arms, to seek funding for us to participate in the commission. The current status now of the matter is that there has been settlements that have been made with the government, but we are awaiting that we should finalize settlements or cases with the president in his personal capacity, as well as with Sibanye.
Thato, just as what Mr. Nkome is mentioning right over there, I mean, one would have assumed that the state would have, of course, said, okay, let's sort of handle or allow for the legal proceedings to happen. That wasn't forthcoming. Already then you sensed that there was a sense of injustice or a lack of willingness to help those families of the victims of, or the families of the victims of Marikana.
Well, I think when SERI got involved representing 36 of the families, their participation in the the commission was obviously extremely limited. And in fact, I think we had to make submissions to the commissioner for him to at least accept victim impact statements for the families, the widows, to share their own experience of what they've just suffered, and what they're going through. And I think that was allowed. But my understanding from the families is that that was nowhere near what would have been adequate. And the recommendations that came out of the Farlam Commission were that further investigations should commence. Of course, there hasn't been enough that came out of the Farlam Commission, but there has been a lot of information that has been somewhat useful in shedding light on what the way forward should be. And I think it is quite unfortunate that the families sit today, 11 years later, with no prosecutions for what happened on the 16th of August. Only 9 officers have been charged for what happened before the 16th of August. And I think between 17 or 18 mine workers were also charged. But you'll also remember, in the immediate aftermath of the mine, the state was very quick to press charges against mine workers. I think they had charged all of them with common purpose murder or something like that. And then, the bulk of those were dropped. And so I think a few are currently standing trial. But it's just unclear why it is taking so long. The NPA has released a statement today about the back and forth that has happened within that department, I guess. But it's just not enough. It's not satisfactory for families to die without closure. Many families have lost more loved ones since the massacre, in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, but also in the years that have passed. There's families that have been touched by suicide. I think 1 or 2 of the families died at the news of hearing about what happened in Marikana. So we're not just dealing with, that brutal murder that was caught on television and what ensued at scene 2, but it's also, the ripple effects of that. So children who lost parents in 2012 are now adults, and they still don't have any kind of answers as to what happened to their parents.
And that stems from that, isn't it? That this delay of justice for the victims' families, because the NPA statement really doesn't give much. Yeah. It's sort of like, one might say, even a copy and paste from previous NPA statements. And that frustration is there for all to see, isn't it?
It is. We must commend the 3 senior prosecutors that have been representing the families in the trial related to the 13th of August. They have been working hard, and they have been doing the best that they can with what they've been given. But our argument is that it's just not enough, right? These are senior prosecutors who are doing the best that they can. They focus on Marikana along with many other matters that they're seized with. And for us, for an incident that is as grave as Marikana, right? This is significant for the entire country. You'd expect that a little more attention and a little more prioritization would have been given to it. So the trial that's happened, that is sitting in Mahikeng relating to the events of the 13th of August, sits at about, a few days at a time, every 3 months. So that trial to date has been sitting for 2 years. And the state is still going to call more witnesses. So you have a trial that's running on 2 years now, relating to the deaths of 3 mine workers and 2 police officers. When we finally turn to the 16th, whenever that will be, how long will that be? Like, how long are we expecting that trial to sit? What kind of resources is the state going to allocate to it? Is it going to sit at days at a time? Is that adequate? Is that fair? Is that what we should accept from the state when we're dealing with something that is yet to be concluded 11 years later?
After the break, we continue this conversation 11 years on from the devastating day of Marikana. My next question to Mr. Nkome is going to be why there is a lack of criminal liability since 11 years on. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're talking 11 years on from the Marikana tragedy. My guests are Andries Nkome, a Marikana defense attorney, and Thato Masingoako, a researcher at SERI. Mr. Nkome, I want to come to you. The lack of criminal liability after that day in 2012, it's there for all to see, because whenever it's brought upon this question to the powers that be that executed whatever orders were executed on that day, whatever instructions were given on that day, it just seems there is a lack of liability there.
Look, our argument from day one has been that the massacre took place, amongst others, as a result of the characterization of the labor dispute as a criminal act. And this was done by the then Deputy President of the country, Mr. SERI Ramaphosa, in his personal capacity, as well as in his capacity as a non-executive director and shareholder of Lonmin. Now, everybody is there to see, understands that to this day, Mr. Ramaphosa is the president of this country. And I take it that everybody can, their guess is as good as mine, insofar as why is there lack of criminal liability. We have at least been able to get a court to agree with us, despite the fact that Judge Ian Falam did not do so. He had only given liability to people as high up, only as to the then police commissioner, Ria Pierre. But we have been arguing that this was a commercial matter. It was also a political influenced matter, such that at the end, it was political head honchos that took a decision as to what should happen to the miners of Marikana. So we are hopeful that we'll be able to come closer to finality so far as getting the president to come through an account, as well as those that had taken a decision with him, in as much as it might have taken a lot of time.
And we are going to be touching on, in the next segment and the segment after that, on the Farlam Commission and, of course, the accountability that President Cyril Ramaphosa may have to take for this. And, of course, both you would be able to argue those facts. Thato, I want to come to you. Let's speak about your organization, SERI, and, of course, the involvement with the families and making sure that these damages that the families had incurred are being paid for, that there's some sort of reimbursement for them. First, I mean, what work is being done for that? And number two, is it enough? Now, we know it's not going to bring back their loved ones or their breadwinners. But what can they be for them? So maybe you can expand on that further, please.
Sure. So SERI submitted, on behalf of the families, their civil claim against the state in 2015. There were negotiations that ensued, and I think payments were paid out between 2018 and 2019 for loss of support. But the claim that was submitted included 5 heads of damages. So one was an apology from the state. Another was loss of support, which is, you've lost a loved one who was providing for your family. If we were to calculate what you were going to get financially, along with a range of other complicated, I think, factors, this is what we can give you for loss of support. The other 3 include medical costs, general damages for the trauma and grief, and then constitutional damages for loss of family life. And that is for children who have lost parents, spouses who have lost their partners, and that is based on the right to a family life in the Constitution. So the state has only made progress on one of those heads of damages, which is loss of support. And our assessment is that they did that in the hopes that the families would, just keep quiet after that. But of course, that was nowhere near all of what the family was asking for, least of which was an apology, an acknowledgement from the state about what has happened to them. In terms of the loss of support damages that are being paid out, as I said, we represent 36 of the families, and 34 families had a settlement. There has been an offer that I think is in the process of being finalized for the 35th family, but concerning the 36th family, the state has refused to compensate. They argue that this mine worker, who was 26 years old when he was killed at Scene 2, because his parents died while he was young, and he was the breadwinner at his home. So he was supporting his siblings and his siblings' children. The state's position is that he didn't have an obligation or a duty to support them. We, of course, disagree with this. We find it outrageous, to say the least, particularly in this country where most people are raised in the context of extended family. It is it's inhumane to question the support he was providing to his family. And you can only imagine what kind of trauma that has added to that family's loss.
Mr. Nkome, over the last decade, with you working on this case, the pain felt by those families, the case of the mine workers that were arrested. Let's talk about how this has strengthened the case from their point of view. And whenever you go into court, whenever there's the arguments against these mine workers and the victims' families, talk to us about it and how, as a legal representative and an attorney, you are able to go in there every time and still have a case that is strong enough for those victims and for those mine workers who were arrested on those days.
As I speak to you, I'm driving from Marikana, and I was supposed to come through and be with you. Now, what I saw there was the status that is keeping on deteriorating. People's lives are keeping on getting even worse, despite the fact that Judge Ian Fala might have made recommendations in relation to their living conditions as well as the socio-economic rights that the mine is supposed to uphold insofar as their workers are concerned. Now, in the beginning, people had been hopeful, especially with the mention of the name of Mama Winnie. People had been hopeful that the president would come through and give an apology. But we know that to this day, he hasn't been able to. So every little gain that has been made solely as a result of including the participation of courts to come through to conclusions. So they are saying they are losing hope from individuals like the president insofar as him coming over to give an apology. And they are hopeful that the courts will make sure that those apologies are given, even if it's by court order and even if it takes a lot more time.
Thato, the unions, now there's always a lukewarm reception to them. There's always the big asterisks or question marks with regards to them. Last year I had Joseph Matunja, who's of course the president of AMCU, and he argues that, it's always capitalism that continues to haunt them. And I'll ask you a question about capitalism in a bit. But how much responsibilities do mining unions need to take about what happened? And, do unions, when looking at what happened at Marikana, do they still work in a capitalist environment? But obviously more on unions and their responsibility about what happened that day, because sometimes all it needs a little bit of fire. And the workers generally tend to listen to what the unions are going to say because they believe it's within their best interest.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is a very tough question. And as you know, the main unions that were involved at Marikana was the National Union of Mine Workers and AMCU, as you mentioned. I understand that NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, was the majority representing union at the time. But what's important to remember is that the mine workers, when they decided first on the 9th of August that they would approach their employer directly, when they did try and approach their mine workers, I think it was on the 10th of August actually, the mine management stopped them immediately. We're not going to engage you outside of the format of your union. So the mine workers were turned away on the 10th of August, and then they decided we will now strike. And then in the days leading up to the 16th, I think it was, I can't tell you the exact date, but they did try to go to the NUM offices. And that, I think, was a situation that sort of fed into the insecurity that the miners would have felt thereafter. And I know there's been a lot of debate and discussion around the violence that unfolds before the 16th, but it's a series of events that culminates in what happens on the 16th of August, including very deliberate decisions that were taken on the part of the mine and the state and the police and all of that. But they get shot at when they approach the NUM offices. because of either rumors spreading around, either people at the NUM offices felt insecure. But at that point, I think a minor is injured, if not more, and he's taken to hospital. But the miners who continue with the strike at that point don't know if he was killed or if he was just injured. So from there, the miners feel unsafe, and you see a steady escalation in what happens. Obviously, trying to enforce the strike, and all of that clashes with the security guards that fire at the mine workers at first. So it's a series of incidents of violence that sort of escalate. And you know what the miners insisted on from the beginning, and even on the 16th, moments before they were shot and killed, the 34 of them, they had consistently insisted on their management, their own employer, engaging them directly. They were not accepting the framework of the unions, and they wanted to speak directly with their mine workers. At different points, I think, with the various documentation of what happened, you see the leader of NUM going to speak to the mine workers. I think he might not have even emerged out of the police vehicle. I think Joseph Matunjwa at some point insists on going closer to the mine workers and speaking to them directly, pleading with them. And this happens more than once. And then the mine workers decide on the 16th that we're going to leave the Kopi and we're going to try and leave. But by then, they had been fenced in by the police, and they only had like a very small space to leave from. The police set off the tear gas and the rubber bullets, and chaos unfolds. But what we must also remember is that after the 16th, the strike continued. It didn't just end on that day. But soon after that, I think AMCU became the dominant party, the dominant union at that point, and the usual relations. I would say, I don't know. If there's a better way of putting that, but the usual relations between employers, mine workers, and the union sort of resumes. But what is important for us to remember is that the mine workers had sort of disrupted that setup. And because of that disruption, and because of how that disruption was perceived as a threat, they were killed. And that is, of course, unfortunate. We should live in a democracy where dissent is tolerated. And I am paraphrasing here from our former executive director who's written about this quite extensively. But our democracy should tolerate dissent. As soon as you don't tolerate dissent and you actually make decisions that will result in the death of people, then we're living in dangerous times.
Well, more dangerous times. We're actually living in a totalitarian state.
Exactly.
I have to stop you there, Thato. After the break, we're going to be talking about the Fahraaz Commission of Inquiry. Was it taken seriously, or was it just another commission that the taxpayer had to fund? Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. Now, in the history of a democratic South Africa, we've had many commissions, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the Fahraaz Commission of Inquiry, to as recent as the Zondo Commission into state capture. There's always question marks and asterisks around these commissions and whether they need to be taken seriously. Now, this is a question for both Mr. Nkome and for Thato. I want to start off with you, Mr. Nkome. Was the Fahraaz Commission really taken seriously, given all the evidence and everything that was presented to Judge Ian Fahraaz and the rest of those sitting on that bench? Mr. Nkome, are you still there? Mr. Nkome? Okay, we seem to have lost Mr. Nkome there. I want to come to you, Thato. Very similar question.
So, look, I think we were hopeful that the Fahraaz Commission of Inquiry would at least provide us with a lot of information and a lot of answers that were needed at the time. It sat for about 2 years and I think cost us about 150 million as a state. And as I mentioned earlier, the family's participation was extremely limited. I think they were given very short amount of time to share their perspective of the impact that the massacre has had on them and what they've suffered. But But a lot of information, I understand, was kept from the commission. Too much time was spent on all sorts of witnesses, and not enough on what happened, how were decisions made. And I think a lot of information was kept from the commission, although it was still valuable in revealing a lot of information, which I suppose has provided the groundwork for the state to proceed with the investigations in line with those recommendations. But it sat for 2 years, and it dragged on. It dragged on, and from our perspective, not enough of that commission was allocated to the key questions. And of course, what we always have to remember, and there are a lot of people that have studied the question of commissions in our country, both before 1994 and after 1994, there's an argument that commissions of inquiry are established by the state to develop a particular narrative that will dominate whatever the incident is. And I suppose in this case, what we came away with was that no one was to blame, except that the mine workers were these crazed, delusional, wild people who were wielding weapons and were posing such a great risk to both the police and the mine. But so much work has been done by the media and researchers all around this issue of Marikana, and we've been able to chip away at that damaging perspective and restore some of the dignity to the mine workers and the families, because it isn't adequate that they've been characterized in the way that they have. I remember my own memory of it when I was still studying was so much time was allocated to a Mr. X, but not enough was allocated to the police who were wielding weapons, live ammunition, who made preparations for mortuary vans to be delivered to the mine, who decided that the 16th of August would be D-Day. Not enough time was spent on those people. And as Mr. Nkome mentioned, the only senior official that has had a finger pointed at them is Ria Pierre, former police commissioner, who has committed herself to fighting tooth and nail against the findings against her in the Farlam Commission of Inquiry, costing the state even more money. So from our perspective, we accept the Commission of Inquiry for what it was. It wasn't entirely satisfactory, but it at least provided us with a starting point to move forward. There were questions that, it didn't address, which it probably should have, and it didn't spend enough time on those other things. But we are where we are today.
Yeah, while we're still trying to get Mr. Nkome on the line, one of those individuals that have been cleared by the Farlam Commission is, of course, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and we are going to touch on him in the next segment because the apology that many of the families are asking for. I want to touch on Ria Pierre because she still is the one senior person that has, that has to be held accountable. As you say, she's fighting tooth and nail to it. But is there still a belief that even if not all recommendations of the Farlam Commission will be adhered to, at least some, from SERI, is there still hope that may happen?
Look, I think we're obliged to keep to hold out hope. We have to remain hopeful that at some point the right leaders will be in a position to make the right decisions and move this process forward as best as possible. But like I said, it isn't sufficient, and it probably isn't fair that she was the only official that took the fall for the entire massacre, when there was a senior SAPS official from Northwest. There was the Minister of Police at the time, Mr. Natim Tetwa. He's proceeded in various other government departments. Then there's the mine itself. There were executives that had made decisions. They had provided facilities to the police to plan their operations. As we said, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, he was involved. And the case that Andries and his team have been leading is about, the extent to which he can be personally held liable for his role. And I think the core of that the case is about the blurring of lines between, the government, wielding political influence, businesses, and where officials sort of can move quite easily between all of these spheres and exert the kind of pressure that we should not allow the police to be put under. So, you know, we do need more people to be held accountable, but you know that the culpability goes right down to the police officers. There were hundreds of police officers there on that day. The news captured in real time, 17 miners getting shot down. And it's not just the shooting down of the miners, it's them standing around while many of these miners bled out. Many of them could have been saved, actually. They didn't actually all have to die, depending on what injuries they suffered. But then there's scene 2, which the police tried as best as possible to keep from the public. They messed with the evidence around that scene. And this comprises of the police in the immediate aftermath of scene 1. They pursue fleeing mine workers for about an hour and kill another 17. Many of those mine workers were surrendering at the time that they were killed. So many have gunshot wounds in the back. And the official narrative from the police was, we were facing risk, we were defending ourselves. But of course, scene 2 paints a very different picture.
After the break, we will continue the conversation, and hopefully we'll have Mr. Nkome to go ahead and, wrap up the conversation. Of course, we're going to ask him of the Falun Commission, but the important question, will the victims get the apology that they truly deserve? Do stay tuned to Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm glad that we have Mr. Andries Nkome back on a line with us. Of course, technology and all of its disadvantages. There are advantages, but there's so much disadvantages to it also. Mr. Nkome, thank you so much for staying with us. I want to talk about the Falun Commission. I'd asked Thato the very same question. I want to get your take on it. Is the Falun Commission of Inquiry still being taken seriously as we speak?
Look, I think the starting point should be the conclusions of a commission of inquiry. The commission of inquiry only ends with what we call recommendations. It is not an order of court. And anybody that participates in inquiry and is not happy with whatever recommendations are made is at liberty to go to a court and get a review made of the commissions. Like, for example, now we have instructions to go and review the findings of Judge Ian Fallam simply because of exactly what Thato stated, that the highest decision-making person that was blamed for Marikana was the then National Police Commissioner. But we know that there were so many other people. We have been maintaining that the commission took place, or the massacre took place as a result of the characterization as a dastardly criminal act by the then president. But at no stage is he blamed. We also understand that the operation between the state as well as lawmen to cause the massacre was planned and operated within a joint operation center, but nobody that assisted in making that has been found guilty. So therefore, not much has been done in relation to the findings of Judge Ian Fallam. I can tell you now that I'm from Marikana as I speak. The area is in squalor. There is no accommodation for the mine workers. The roads are not maintained. There's just pigs all over and dogs. And therefore, we can only hope that justice will come to the people of Marikana out of a court process, simply because, like, for example, Thato stated that cross-examinations was limited. The commission gave so much credit and time to Mr. X, whilst when the president was being cross-examined, the parties had been given a limited time. Whilst in court, that will not take place. So therefore, there is more hope of a finding and justice in courts than there will be out of a commission of inquiry.
Mr. Nkome, of course, you've just come from Marikana 11 years on. Not much has changed. Actually, it's gotten worse. And it's a question for both you and Thato. It really is a sad state, isn't it, that close to 30 years on from democracy, not much has been done from the state, or even Sibanye-Stillwater, who's right now the operating mine within Marikana. And that just shows again that justice is just so far away for those victims, even though you, as the defense attorney, are doing what you can to help the families. From a social perspective, there just is no improvement for the families and the communities of Marikana.
It is a very, very sad state. And we had hoped that we wouldn't be here at this time talking about the very same issue that we spoke about 11 years back. But I can tell you now that the reason why all of this is happening is for all to see. And we're all seeking just to have a simple apology. People of Marikana are saying, we had wished the president could have come to us and apologized, and then we could have then decided as to what then next insofar as the tragedy that took place in Marikana. But today, we're here, we're saying 90% of the claims have been settled, but we don't have any commitment by the president to say, I would like to settle also personal liability claims that have been placed against me. In actual fact, the president came and raised technical exceptions where he was seeking to dismiss our client's claims. But we went to court, argued, and the court agreed with us that indeed, yes, there is legal and factual liability for the president to come through and answer. So what we are now waiting for is for the same assistance that we received from the DJP as well as the JP to prioritize this matter, get an earlier date, let's have an argument and have the president come through to court in person and testify to that he did not characterize the massacre as a dastardly criminal act. He also did not state that the police must take concomitant action. And we should be able then to have a court decide that it's either compelling him to apologize and also compelling him to personally bear the cost of our clients and compensate them or not.
Same question for you, Thato. You've probably been to Marikana. You've seen there. I haven't been there. I've just driven past there. So you'd know best, both you and Mr. Nkome would know best about the community. Nothing has changed.
No, there is an absolute lack of basic services, as Mr. Nkome said, lack of water, lack of access to adequate sanitation.
And this is 50 years on from democracy.
Yeah. Housing, all of those kinds of issues have been raised, over the years. And what we have to remember is Lonmin, at the time that the massacre took place, they had a social and labor plan that promised to build thousands of housing for the mine workers. By the time that the massacre had happened, I think they'd only built 3 houses. A social and labor plan is something that is binding on the mine, as far as I understand it, and the state should be enforcing that. But, when the massacre happens, it's clear that the mine had completely failed in its own obligations, while at the same time, running a mine and making millions and billions of rands at the same time. And so, I don't know how well Sibanye-Stillwater is doing in terms of keeping up with its own social and labor plan, but it acquired Lonmin with all its problems. And at the time that they had acquired Lonmin, I think the CEO at the time, I think he's still the CEO, Neil Froneman. Yeah, he had met with the families and said, that they want to facilitate healing. But my understanding of their position, and you would know that they have embarked on a Marikana renewal project. So they've appointed a team of people who are sort of facilitating this process. My take from participating in at least some of those engagements is the position of the mine, which is that, they are not Lonmin, although they acquired Lonmin, and that, all that they're doing is out of the goodness of their hearts. And, I think that is not a satisfactory approach to take. You either take responsibility or you don't. You have acquired the mine with all the history that it comes with. And so you should be doing more, not only to assist the community in which you're drawing minerals out of the ground from, but to be led by the victims of the massacre in terms of what justice means to them.
Mr. Nkome, throughout the discussion, the word apology has always been brought up. 2012, Cyril Ramaphosa is then the deputy president of the country. He's also a director of Lonmin. He's now the sitting head of state of our country. Do you honestly believe, if he could not give that apology when he was the deputy president, are you still hopeful, as we sit right now, all 3 of us, that he's going to do so as the head of state, apologize for the families, but not only apologize to the families, find a way to bring some sort of closure and do so in a manner that a head of state would need to do?
The president had made a commitment at the funeral of Mama Winnie Mandela to say that he's going to go with the president of the EFF, Julius Selo Malema, to go to Marikana and have an apology. And everybody had been hopeful that if he says that at the funeral of somebody that serious, that is revered for having caused unity in the nation, he could possibly be serious and could go and make an apology in person. But what we've seen over the time is that commitment that he made in front of thousands and thousands of people, he has not taken it seriously. He has not gone through to make the apology. So it's for that reason that our clients are saying they are losing hope. They've lost hope in that the apology will come unconditionally and without being coerced from the president. And they're saying the last forums for hope in their case, insofar as getting that apology, is the courts.
Mr. Nkome, I want to close off with you because we are running a bit out of time. What next now for your role as the Marikana defense attorney? And when we are next year, this time, when it's 12 years on from what happened, are we confident that as South Africans, and are you confident as a Marikana defense attorney, that there will be some sort of closure that will be happening? Are we going to be having a very similar conversation again in 2024?
We heard only yesterday through IPIT that a team of advocates have been appointed to deal with the prosecutions of the matters that took place within Marikana. We are hopeful that very soon we should have a meeting out of which we should be able to discuss and inform them of what evidence we say we have in making sure that they can prosecute whoever that we say has been liable. And I can tell you now that the process, insofar as seeking to have a prioritization of the personal liability matter against the president, we are pursuing on with it. And we are also going to be taking instructions from clients in relation to the review of the findings of the Falam Commission. So I can tell you now that there's those processes, we are hopeful that they don't have to take the next 11 years.
Mr. Nkome, I would like to thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point, and all the best in your continuous representation for the victims and the families of that tragic day in Marikana. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Andries Nkome, Marikana defense attorney. Thato, I'm just going to need you to stay with me for a bit. The question I asked Andries, Mr. Nkome, earlier on, the apology from the president, do you foresee it happening? And just, of course, to add on to that, the work that SERI is going to continuously do to make sure that the families of those affected by what happened on that day, there is some sort of justice that can occur.
We absolutely stand with the families and will be with them until they do get closure and they do get justice. You know, what Mr. Nkome said, it's true. The president made a promise at Winnie Mandela's funeral, but he also made that promise in his State of the Nation address, I think a few months prior to that. And, you know, it's not clear why he just won't keep his word. I think the families continue to wait. All they want is, you know, some kind of sympathy and empathy from the state. And so, you know, we really do encourage the president, anyone who is with him in the presidency, to encourage him to just go to the families and just express that remorse that he has expressed in other formats. You know, he's spoken about this in various other formats, acknowledging that, you know, there have been various, there is a role that various people played and that everyone should take responsibility for what happened. He just hasn't said that to the families directly. So, you know, we plead with him, we plead with the state to just do that because it'll go a long way in facilitating healing for the victims of the massacre. It will mean a lot to children who have lost parents, spouses who have lost their husbands, parents who lost children. It would mean a lot to them.
Thato, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
That's Thato Masingoako. She's a researcher at SERI, and of course, her in her organization doing a lot of work in terms of trying to bring closure and justice for the families of Marikana. There is no more sitting on the fence with regards to this. And when it comes to justice for the families, when it comes to having closure, and when it comes to them, the community of Marikana, just living the way a democratic is supposed to live and living in a humane way, then they are needing of it and they deserve all of it. The question is, will the state come to the frame? And most importantly, will Sibanye Stillwater, who rakes in billions and billions of rands every year from the mining activities that I've been doing, there has to be a part played by both state and business to uplift those communities. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. We'd also like to thank Mr. Andries Nkome for joining us, Thato Masingoako from SERI for joining us here. Hopefully when we talk about Marikana next year, we'll be talking about it in a more optimistic way, and that justice is served for those families. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team here for Talking Point on Hilaal TV channel 347. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.